Victorian men did not fear disease as much as they feared being seen. Their gloves hid rot, shame, and secrets that could shatter entire households. Beneath polished leather were hands that told stories no photograph dared to capture. What survived in museums was not elegance, but silence stitched tight. Tonight we will walk into that silence to understand what those gloves were truly hiding. So, before you feel comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Only if your heart truly wants to. If you do like it, leave a little comment, letting me know what time it is where you are. Now, dim the lights. Adjust the pillow to fit your head. Maybe turn on a fan to create a relaxing atmosphere. And let's begin this journey together tonight. If one were to stand inside a Victorian drawing room and watch the slow, deliberate movements of its gentlemen, the first thing that would feel strangely out of place is how their hands never touched the open air. The gloves stayed on through conversation, through meals, through the quiet passing of letters across polished tables. They were part of the body, treated with the same instinctive care as skin itself. What looked like elegance from a distance became unsettling when observed closely. The refusal to expose even a fingertip, the constant adjustment of cuffs to ensure nothing beneath escaped the fabric's control. It suggested not modesty, but fear of what a bare hand might reveal. The men who wore these gloves understood the unspoken rule of their time. A gentleman's body was not merely his own. It was a public symbol of discipline, morality, and status. Hands, especially, were the first markers of this constructed image. Smoothness implied refinement. Firmness suggested control. Clean lines of knuckles and nails hinted at self-governance. A hand that failed, these expectations threatened not only his image, but his place within the delicate hierarchy Victorian society prized above all else. Beneath the satin or kid leather, however, the truth often looked very different. Illness had a way of settling into the hands before the rest of the body. Sores appeared in clusters, sometimes small enough to hide, sometimes too large to ignore. Fingers stiffened, cracked, or swelled until simple movements became painful. Some men watched their nails turn dark and lift from the flesh. Others saw the skin between their knuckles begin to break apart, forming small fissures that throbbed under pressure. They continued wearing gloves because removing them would mean confronting the decay directly. And in the Victorian world, confronting decay was a private shame, not a public matter. In the dim light of parlours and clubs, gloves disguised everything. A gentleman could raise a glass, do sign a document, shake a hand, and no one would question the unseen condition of the skin beneath. Gloves flattened swelling, masked trembling, absorbed fluid, and concealed the sour smell of infection. They created a distance between the wearer and the world, allowing him to pass through society without suspicion. The illusion was so complete that even those closest to him, friends, colleagues, and sometimes his own household, could remain unaware of the quiet damage progressing under the material. It was not unusual for gloves to remain on, even within the privacy of the home. In families that prized appearance, men learned to hide the smallest imperfection. A split cuticle, a discoloured patch of skin, or a small ulcer could be enough to stir questions they did not wish to answer. Some wives accepted the constant presence of gloves without comment, believing it a habit of etiquette rather than concealment. Others suspected more, but found silence easier than truth. In a world where moral worth was measured by outward presentation, even spouses hesitated to uncover what lay beneath. The gloves themselves became part of the deception. Soft fabrics absorbed what the wearer hoped no one would see. Dark colours were favoured by those with bleeding under the skin, while paler shades appealed to men whose marks were dry and crusted rather than wet. The interior linings held more secrets than any doctor's ledger. Flakes of skin, streaks of dried pus. The faint outlines of nails rotted away. Some gloves were worn until the fingers thinned from overuse, their seams strained by the swelling they tried to contain. These were replaced quietly, often at night, when the household slept. Looking at this from a modern perspective, it is difficult not to draw comparisons to contemporary habits of concealment. Today, it might be makeup, filters, or carefully curated images that hide flaws people would rather deny. In Victorian times, gloves played that role with chilling efficiency. They allowed men to walk through public spaces while carrying private deterioration like a hidden burden strapped to their skin. The contrast between polished exterior and failing interior created a kind of cognitive calm, a belief that as long as decay stayed covered, it did not fully exist. The deeper truth is that many men did not wear gloves simply out of vanity. They wore them because they had no other way to live with the consequences of their own bodies. Medical care was unreliable, treatments experimental, and diagnoses inconsistent. Some conditions spread slowly, others violently. All carried stigma. Illness was often associated with moral failure, impurity, or indulgence. The shame attached to disease could be more damaging than the disease itself. Forcing men into silence long after help might still have been possible. Social expectations reinforced this silence. A gentleman who showed weakness in his hands risked more than embarrassment. He risked exclusion. In a society obsessed with self-control, losing control over one's flesh was seen as a failing of character. Gloves became both armor and prison, preserving dignity while trapping the wearer inside his fears. The gesture of slipping them on each morning was a ritual of survival, a small act of resistance against a world that demanded flawless bodies but offered little mercy. Even within male circles, clubs, taverns, and workplaces, the gloves remained. Removing them would expose vulnerability in environments where strength was currency. Some men developed the skill of using their gloved hands so naturally that the gesture of wearing them appeared effortless rather than compensatory. They learned to drink, write, and gesture gracefully, masking discomfort behind practiced ease. But when they returned home, the removal of gloves could reveal fingers trembling with pain, palms burning from infection, or skin discolored by spreading disease. The tragedy lies in how normalized this concealment became. No one questioned why gloves were worn so constantly. No one wondered about the stories they hid. Instead, they were admired as accessories of refinement and discipline. The more tightly a man clung to his gloves, the more respectable he appeared. The irony is almost cruel. The more decay he hid, the more dignity he was believed to possess. The gloves gave structure to a fragile illusion, even as the flesh beneath continued to decline. Another layer of guarded silence waits just beyond this point, deepening the unease that shaped Victorian masculinity. What these men concealed beneath their covered hands hints at something far more disturbing than a simple fear of illness. Gloves in Victorian society were more than decorative clothing. They were a signal announcing a man's place in the world before he ever spoke. A properly gloved hand suggested control, restraint, and adherence to the unwritten codes that governed every corner of respectable life. In public spaces, men moved with calculated care, ensuring their gloves were spotless, fitted, and unwrinkled. The smallest imperfection could draw silent judgment. A scuff on the leather hinted at carelessness. A missing glove hinted at something worse. Social order depended on symbols, and gloves were one of its clearest and most unforgiving markers. To remove gloves in front of women was considered an intrusion, a break in propriety that felt oddly intimate. The exposure of bare skin carried implications of familiarity that polite society preferred to avoid. Gloves maintained a distance that men relied on, a boundary that spared them from revealing anything unintended. When a man entered a room, women expected the gloves to stay in place unless a handshake demanded their removal. and even then, the gesture was brief and reluctantly performed. The hand revealed was a fleeting glimpse, and the glove returned to its rightful place as soon as politeness allowed. In contrast, bare hands belonged to those whose lives were ruled by labour rather than etiquette. The rough-skinned men who worked in factories, mines, docks, or fields had no use for the polished refinement of gloves. Their hands bore scars, grime, and blunt force, evidence of survival rather than manners. In Victorian eyes, these hands symbolized a lack of refinement, a life governed by necessity rather than morality. Seeing ungloved hands on a gentleman would have been socially jarring, a sign that he had slipped from his station or abandoned the expectations that defined him. Gloves maintained the illusion that respectability could be worn like fabric. Within drawing rooms, lecture halls, and offices, gloves reinforced the silent hierarchy of men observing one another. They covered the body part most likely to reveal nervousness or illness. Hands tremble, sweat, swell, or stiffen. Gloves prevented these betrayals from becoming public knowledge. A man could be anxious, weakened, or unwell, yet appear controlled as long as his gloves stayed on. This illusion was essential in a society that valued composure above honesty. The ability to hide one's weaknesses was considered a necessary moral strength. Even if the concealment bordered on deception, the connection between gloves and virtue became deeply ingrained. Moral authorities preached about the discipline of the body, and gloves conveniently supported that doctrine. Wearing them demonstrated self-management, a visible commitment to cleanliness and restraint. Men who adhered to glove etiquette were assumed to possess equal discipline in their private lives, an assumption rarely questioned. In a world obsessed with appearances, virtue was often measured not by action, but by presentation. A man's gloves could testify to his character, even when his actions did not. Gloves also served as silent judges in social situations. A man who failed to observe glove etiquette marked himself as unreliable, uneducated, or morally questionable, removing gloves too casually, wearing them in poor condition, or neglecting them altogether positioned him dangerously close to impropriety. Conversations could halt, glances shift, and reputations erode from a single breach of etiquette. Respectability was fragile, and gloves were one of its most delicate supports. Even in business dealings, gloves held symbolic power. A gloved handshake carried reassurance, formality, and a sense of mutual trust between men. It preserved distance while confirming respect. A bar hand, by contrast, introduced unwelcome closeness. It disrupted the careful rituals of commerce and risked exposing something raw or uncontrolled. Gloves provided a buffer that allowed transactions to proceed without emotional interruption, reinforcing the notion that business was structured, rational, and clean, even when reality was not. As industrialization expanded, the contrast between gloved gentlemen and bare-handed laborers grew sharper. Factories produced wealth for some and injuries for others. Gloves became metaphors for the divide. One class covered the consequences of modern life, while the other bore them openly. The polished surfaces of middle and upper-class gloves obscured the grime and blood that fueled the empire's progress. The social order depended on this blindness. The smoother the gloves appeared, the easier it was to pretend the world underneath them was equally refined. Yet the expectations surrounding gloves were not only social, they became deeply personal. Boys learned from an early age that proper gloves were part of becoming a man. They watched their fathers prepare for outings, carefully selecting gloves that matched the occasion. Soft leather for dinner, sturdier fabric for daytime errands, formal pairs for ceremonies. This grooming ritual taught them that their bodies needed to be managed, controlled, and shielded from public view. Refinement became inseparable from concealment. The discipline of wearing gloves also shaped how men saw one another. A well-gloved man was presumed orderly, perhaps even admirable. A man who refused gloves suggested rebellion or instability. Even the smallest variation, like a glove slightly too loose or too tight, could hint at a character flaw. Men judged one another silently, building hierarchies from the smallest gestures. Gloves became shorthand for respectability, morality, and social belonging. Behind all this formality, however, lingered a quiet anxiety. Many men feared that exposing their hands could expose something more than skin, a weakness, a mistake, a shame they could not articulate. Gloves allowed them to participate in polite society without revealing the burdens they carried. The social system rewarded this concealment, reinforcing the idea that dignity could be maintained only through careful hiding. The more tightly a man followed glove etiquette, the more he disappeared behind it. Seen from a modern perspective, it resembles the way people curate images online, choosing filters and angles that hide exhaustion or imperfection. In Victorian life, gloves served as the filter. They sanitized the body, presenting a version of masculinity that was polished and controlled, even when, beneath the surface, the truth grew darker. The gloves preserved the illusion that men were stable, disciplined, and unblemished, even as their private realities told a different story. This intertwining of fashion and morality created a culture where exposure felt dangerous, and concealment felt safe. Gloves were not just accessories, they were shields that allowed men to move through a rigid society without fear of judgment. Every pair worn, every interaction mediated by fabric, reinforced a worldview where appearance defined worth, and truth remained hidden beneath the surface. The strict etiquette surrounding gloves preserved a comforting illusion of order, even as it discouraged anyone from questioning what lay beneath. These rules formed a brittle structure of respectability that men clung to with increasing desperation. The tension between polished surfaces and private realities only deepened, pointing to a quieter struggle hidden behind the fabric itself. Disease settled into the hands of Victorian men with a quiet persistence that left little room for denial. The fingers were often the first to betray what the rest of the body tried to hide, showing signs of infection long before symptoms became visible elsewhere. Sores appeared along the knuckles, sometimes small and round, sometimes spreading in uneven patches that darkened the skin. The slightest pressure could cause them to weep, leaving stains that gloves absorbed without protest. For many men, these marks were the earliest warnings of illnesses they preferred not to acknowledge. Syphilis and other venereal diseases often transformed the hands in ways that polite society refused to discuss. The progression was gradual at first, with tender spots, tingling sensations, or a slight stiffness when bending the fingers. As the disease advanced, the fingertips could swell, nails could loosen, and the skin could crack into deep, painful fissures. Some men found that their fingers bent at angles they could not correct, as if the bones themselves were shifting beneath the flesh. The disfigurement embarrassed them more than the pain. Gloves became essential not to soothe the wounds, but to spare them from questions. Other conditions left different but equally troubling marks. Skin tuberculosis created lesions that spread slowly, refusing to heal even with repeated treatments. Eczema caused relentless itching, making the skin red, ardor, and sensitive to the slightest friction. Leprosy carried its own set of terrors: numb patches, loss of sensation, and the gradual thinning of the skin until it tore with the slightest movement. These diseases advanced quietly, sometimes without fever or warning, making their victims appear healthy as long as their hands remained covered. The medical care available to these men offered little reassurance. Treatments ranged from unreliable to harmful. Doctors prescribed ointments mixed with mercury, arsenic, or acids, promising relief while often worsening the damage. Some advise patients to rest their hands, a nearly impossible suggestion for men whose work depended on constant use. Others attributed the conditions to poor hygiene or moral weakness, reinforcing the idea that illness reflected personal failure. Faced with inconsistent care and harsh judgment, many men chose silence over treatment. The wounds behaved unpredictably. Some shrank for weeks before erupting again in clusters. Others scabbed over only to split open during simple tasks. A handshake could send a sharp pain through the entire arm. Writing too long could cause bleeding along the knuckles. Even turning the pages of a book could tear the skin if the fingers swelled at the wrong moment. Gloves minimized the friction, but they could not prevent the constant awareness of what lay beneath. In social gatherings, these hidden conditions created an unspoken tension. Men avoided discussing illness, as doing so risked revealing too much about their private lives. A gentleman whose glove fit too loosely might be suspected of swelling beneath. One who wore gloves that extended unusually high up the wrist might be hiding more extensive lesions. Each gesture became a quiet negotiation with the body, a way of navigating discomfort without allowing it to surface. From a modern perspective, it is unsettling to imagine the degree of suffering concealed under such thin layers of fabric. Many of these diseases were highly infectious, spreading through small cuts or unnoticed abrasions. A shared object, a handshake, or a stray touch could transmit them. Yet the pressure to hide symptoms prevented men from taking precautions that might have protected others. Their silence was shaped by a society that judged them more harshly for having a visible wound than for spreading it. The secrecy surrounding these illnesses had profound consequences. Some men continued to work or socialize even as their hands grew increasingly damaged, fearing the loss of reputation more than physical decline. Others withdrew from public life, avoiding gatherings where gloves might draw unwanted attention. A few sought discreet medical help, traveling to distant clinics or consulting doctors known for their willingness to keep records anonymous. But for many, the concealment felt like the only manageable response. Their hands became private battlegrounds, slowly deteriorating beneath layers of leather and cloth. Even within the home, honesty was rare. Wives might notice the stiffness in their husbands' movements or the way they avoided using certain fingers, but the explanations offered were vague and unconvincing. Some women suspected venereal disease but lacked the authority to confront it. Others accepted silence as part of marriage, especially when social expectations taught them not to pry. Children rarely saw their father's bare hands, growing up believing that gloves were simply part of a man's everyday attire. The gradual decline of the hands mirrored a broader cultural pattern in Victorian life. The refusal to engage with discomfort until it became impossible to ignore. Men tolerated increasing pain because acknowledging it felt like an admission of moral or social failure. They continued writing, working, shaking hands, and fulfilling their duties with gestures that grew heavier each day. The gloves allowed them to maintain the illusion of strength. But beneath the surface, the body told a different story. The diseases hidden beneath those carefully fitted gloves revealed vulnerabilities that Victorian men could not admit aloud. They lived with wounds that deepened over time, bound by expectations that discouraged honesty and rewarded silence. What these damaged hands carried into the world hinted at a far deeper conflict between appearance and suffering, one that the fabric alone could not fully contain. The preservation of honor in Victorian society depended heavily on what could be concealed, and gloves became one of the most effective tools for managing that concealment. A gentleman's reputation lived and died by the surface he presented to the world. Any hint of physical imperfection, especially one associated with disease, threatened to unravel the carefully structured identity he relied upon. Gloves created a barrier, sturdy enough to protect that image, yet subtle enough to appear merely fashionable. In a culture steeped in hypocrisy, they served as a silent reassurance that appearances could remain intact, even when truth had already begun to decay beneath the skin. The connection between gloves and moral purity was not accidental. Men feared suspicion almost as much as illness itself. A visible lesion on the hand could raise doubts about where it came from, and those doubts often mattered more than the actual diagnosis. In a world where venereal diseases were spoken of in hushed tones and moral condemnation came faster than sympathy, the implications were severe. Even a minor blemish could invite devastating assumptions. Gloves prevented those assumptions from forming, or at least delayed them long enough for a man to maintain social stability. Reputation functioned as currency for Victorian men, especially those in professional or public roles. A rotting or visibly damaged hand could jeopardize careers, marriages, and financial prospects. Employers might see a diseased hand as a sign of poor judgment. Colleagues might view it as a threat to their own standing. Suitors could be rejected before they ever had the chance to speak. The stakes were high, and men understood that hiding their hands offered more protection than any physician. Covering the symptoms became part of daily survival. The society that demanded moral purity did little to support those who failed to meet its ideals. Rather than offering treatment or compassion, it encouraged silence. Diseases linked to sexuality, especially syphilis, carried a humiliation so intense that men preferred to endure pain privately rather than seek help openly. Gloves allowed them to participate in social life without revealing the extent of their suffering. They could shake hands, "Do I do?" and sit through meetings without risking disclosure. Every gesture felt safer when the truth remained hidden beneath layers of leather. Fear shaped their behavior in ways that extended beyond physical concealment. Men developed habits to minimize attention to their hands, holding them still, keeping them close to the body, and avoiding gestures that might loosen the glove or reveal its stiffness. Some learned to use only their wrists or forearms when expressing emphasis during conversation. These adaptations became so ingrained that they blended seamlessly into the rituals of politeness. Observers seldom recognized that such movements were driven not by refinement, but by desperation. The hypocrisy of the society that judged them was striking. Many of the same men who condemned sexual impropriety privately visited brothels or engaged in affairs that exposed them to the very illnesses they despised. They protected themselves not by changing their behavior, but by hiding its consequences. Gloves allowed them to maintain the illusion of moral superiority while ignoring the realities of their own choices. The contradiction became part of the social fabric, vice behind closed doors, virtue displayed at dinner parties. Within the home, the role of gloves in safeguarding honor took on a more intimate form. Some men kept their hands covered around their families, claiming sensitivity to cold or discomfort from daily work. Wives who asked questions received vague answers, while children accepted the presence of gloves as a normal aspect of adulthood. For men with advanced symptoms, removing gloves even briefly risked alarming the household. The family's perception of the father's stability depended on the consistency of his outward presentation, and gloves ensured that consistency remained unbroken. The fear of exposure extended into moments of vulnerability. Men avoided medical examinations unless necessary, knowing that a doctor's recognition could lead to gossip or informal condemnation. Even within clinics, patients wore gloves until the last possible moment, hoping to delay the moment when their true condition would be seen. The anxiety of revealing a diseased hand became a deeper wound than the illness itself. Shame infiltrated their routines, shaping their interactions and silently eroding their sense of self. Over time, the gloves themselves carried the weight of this struggle. They absorbed blood, pus, sweat, and the slow decay of tissue, holding pieces of the wearer's pride alongside pieces of his skin. Some gloves stiffened at the fingertips, molded by the deformities underneath. Others grew darkened at the palms or seams. Despite repeated attempts at cleaning, the more damaged the hands became, the more the gloves were polished and replaced, reinforcing the false image of a man in constant control. It was a grim cycle. As the body deteriorated, the facade grew stronger. From a modern perspective, Such desperate concealment seems both tragic and familiar. People today still hide their illnesses, their fears, their insecurities behind carefully managed appearances. Victorian men simply did so with gloves, crafting a polished exterior that protected them from judgment at the cost of isolation. They believed that preserving honor required hiding suffering, even when the burden became impossible to bear. The gloves defended reputations that could shatter with a single glimpse beneath the fabric, preserving dignity even as the truth continued to rot. That fragile armor held firm only because society insisted that men hide their wounds rather than confront them. Beneath that carefully maintained surface lingered a deeper fear, one that reached far into the core of Victorian masculinity and refused to be spoken aloud. The glove industry in Victorian England expanded not because fashion demanded it, but because fear quietly fueled the market. As men grew increasingly anxious about the appearance of their hands, glove makers found themselves at the center of a thriving trade built on secrecy and desperation. Workshops that once produced modest accessories for formal occasions began receiving unusual requests. Longer cuffs, thicker materials, tighter stitching, and designs meant to obscure rather than adorn. The rise of these specialized gloves reflected an unspoken truth. The more diseased the hands beneath them became, the more elaborate the gloves had to be. Custom orders became routine. Men who could afford tailored clothing demanded gloves measured to the millimeter, ensuring a precise fit that revealed no irregularities beneath the surface. Some wanted extended lengths that reached far up the forearm, creating a barrier between wrist and sleeve so no gap could accidentally expose a lesion. Others requested reinforced tips to hide swelling in the fingers or weakened nails. The more a man's condition advanced, the more he invested in gloves that hid what he feared anyone might see. Tailors learned to craft not for elegance, but for concealment. Material choice played a crucial role in maintaining this illusion. Kid leather remained popular because of its smoothness, but glove makers increasingly blended materials to achieve opacity and durability. The fabric had to be thick enough to prevent wet spots from seeping through, spots that betrayed infection or constant bleeding, yet thin enough to remain flexible, allowing the wearer to move without drawing attention. The challenge forced craftsmen to innovate, balancing aesthetic expectations with practical demands. A glove that creased too easily suggested stiffness beneath. One that stretched too much hinted at swelling. Perfection required subtle engineering. Some workshops developed reputations for discretion, attracting men who needed gloves that could withstand the realities of disease. These tailors understood the coded language their clients used. When a man asked for gloves with added reinforcement, the tailor knew he likely needed fingertips that would not collapse under pressure. When another requested improved lining, it often meant he needed something that could absorb fluid without staining through. These euphemisms protected both sides of the transaction. The tailor did not ask questions, and the client did not offer explanations. Specialized gloves for difficult cases became a hidden submarket. These were designed for men who could no longer rely on ordinary materials to conceal their condition. Some gloves were double-lined to mask persistent moisture. Others used dark dyes to camouflage blood or pus. A few even incorporated removable inner layers, allowing wearers to swap out soaked sections without replacing the entire glove. These innovations rarely appeared in catalogues. They were traded through quiet conversations and trusted networks. The industry learned to cater to silence. Workshops that provided these discreet services often grew wealthier than their peers. Fear guaranteed steady business. A man whose disease progressed needed new gloves frequently. As materials degraded under constant strain, tailors serving this clientele understood that repeat orders were unavoidable. They expanded their shops, hired more skilled craftsmen, and invested in tools that allowed them to produce gloves more rapidly. Behind the polished storefronts lay a system driven not by luxury, but by panic. Even glove sizing changed during this period. Standard sizes became insufficient as swelling, deformity, or stiffness made traditional measurements unreliable. tailors began offering more customizable dimensions, measuring not only finger length, but the circumference of each knuckle, the curvature of each joint, and the thickness of the palm. The process could take hours, particularly when the client wanted to hide abnormalities without allowing the tailor to see them directly. Some men took measurements at home and sent written instructions, fearing exposure to shop workers. The accuracy of these self-measurements varied, leading to gloves that stretched in unnatural ways. The industry's growth reflected broader cultural anxieties. Victorian society prized cleanliness and restraint, yet its lack of medical regulation allowed diseases to spread widely. Those who suffered relied on gloves to protect their reputations in a world where illness carried moral judgment. The glove trade capitalized on this insecurity, offering a product that preserved illusion even as the body deteriorated beneath it. Demand rose not because gloves became fashionable, but because the fear of being seen became unbearable. The craftsmanship also took on a strangely clinical dimension. Tailors found themselves inspecting wear patterns to determine how best to reinforce weak areas. Gloves returned for repair often revealed more about the wearer's condition than the wearer ever admitted. The stains, the stretching, the tearing, each told a quiet story of decline. Tailors learned to read these signs without commenting on them, understanding that discretion was as valuable as skill. From a distance, the glove shops appeared ordinary, windows filled with neatly arranged rows of fine leather, satin, and silk. Customers came and went, selecting colours that matched their coats and hats. But behind the counter, in the workrooms, where craftsmen laboured over intricate stitching, the truth was unavoidable. Many of the gloves produced were not accessories for style, but instruments for hiding decay. They were shields designed to mask the physical consequences of disease in a society that preferred ignorance to honesty. The rise of this industry shows how deeply the fear of exposure shaped Victorian identity. Men invested in gloves not merely to look refined, but to protect the fragile sense of dignity that illness threatened to destroy. The more terrified they were of being judged, the more elaborate the gloves became, until the glove itself served as a second skin, one stronger, cleaner, and more dependable than the flesh it concealed. The growing demand for specialized gloves revealed an undercurrent of anxiety that drove men toward concealment rather than treatment. This expanding craft thrived because it offered a way to maintain appearances when the body could no longer cooperate. Under those carefully stitched seams lingered the quiet desperation of men who feared discovery more than disease itself. Men who once wandered through dim brothels and private rooms found themselves living with consequences they never spoke of aloud. Pleasure had been purchased easily, in transactions carried out behind curtains and down narrow alleys. But the aftermath settled quietly into their hands. The first signs were subtle. An irritation beneath a nail, a tenderness along the finger's edge. But the progressions soon became unmistakable. What had once been instruments of indulgence gradually transformed into reminders of decay, visible only to the men who hid them beneath gloves they refused to remove. Syphilis, in its second stage, attacked the hands with a cruelty that made secrecy essential. Nails loosened, turning soft at their bases before detaching entirely. The skin around them thinned, split, and peeled away, exposing raw tissues that stung with even the lightest touch. Some fingers grew swollen and misshapen, shaped less by bone than by the infection slowly consuming them. Men noticed discoloration spreading along their knuckles, dark reds, sickly yellows, and bruised purples that no glove could safely reveal. Each morning, the hands they once used without thought greeted them with new signs of destruction. These were the same hands they had placed on velvet cushions, smooth arms, and welcoming waists. Now they trembled when buttoning shirts or raising glasses. The past lingered in every wound, yet admitting the connection felt unthinkable. Victorian society condemned venereal disease as a moral failure, not a medical condition. Men feared not only the illness, but the judgment that followed. A syphilitic hand marked a man as reckless, indulgent, and corrupted. Reputation died long before the body did. Gloves kept that death at bay. Even those who suspected they were infected hesitated to seek treatment. Doctors examined such conditions with clinical detachment, but they could not offer true discretion. Rumors traveled easily, and a whisper about a man's disease could spread through his workplace or social circle in days. Seeking help meant risking exposure. Avoiding help meant certain decline. Between these choices, many men chose the path that preserved their image, not their health. Their gloves became the only barrier between private agony and public ruin. Some tried simple remedies, applying powders or ointments that promised to dry the sores or strengthen the nails. These treatments rarely worked and often worsened the damage. Infections deepened, and the fingers became tender to the slightest pressure. A handshake could send pain up the arm. Writing caused cramps that stiffened the entire hand. Small tasks took longer, accompanied by the constant fear that someone might notice a wince or a hesitation. The gloves helped disguise stiffness, but they could not fully conceal the strain etched into each movement. Men who frequented brothels carried a particularly heavy burden. They lived with the knowledge that their own choices had led to their condition, even as society refused to acknowledge the hypocrisy surrounding such encounters. The very culture that condemned venereal disease tolerated the industries that spread it. Brothels operated openly enough to thrive, yet the consequences they produced were treated as personal sins rather than societal failures. The resulting shame kept men silent, ensuring the cycle continued unbroken. Some returned to the same establishments even after noticing symptoms. Driven by habit or denial, they wore gloves more often, sometimes even during intimate encounters, believing the fabric could shield them from themselves. It was an illusion, but one they clung to desperately. Others withdrew completely, avoiding places and people that reminded them of past indulgence. In quiet rooms and dim hallways, they learned to navigate life through barriers. Emotional, social, and physical. The glove became the most literal of these barriers, covering not only disease but guilt. From the outside, nothing appeared amiss. The gloves were clean, well-fitted, and expected in public spaces. No one questioned why a man wore them constantly. The secrecy worked because society preferred not to confront the truth. Respectability depended on maintaining surfaces, not uncovering what lay underneath. A man could carry disease on his hands while being praised for his composure. The contradiction suited everyone involved. The most tragic element of this concealment was how preventable the suffering could have been. Early treatment might have slowed the progression, but the stigma surrounding venereal disease made honesty impossible. Men learned to let their hands decay because acknowledging the truth felt like a deeper kind of death. They endured the smell of infection trapped under leather, the constant throbbing when sores reopened, and the dread that came with each new sign of deterioration. Their gloves absorbed everything: blood, pus, fear, and still the illusion held. From a modern perspective, it is unsettling to imagine how many men walked the streets with hands already halfway to rote, gripping canes, tipping hats, or signing documents with fingers barely able to hold a pen. They maintained poise while hiding a destruction that grew more severe each day. Society judged the moral implications of their illness far more harshly than the suffering itself, leaving them no choice but to hide until the body could no longer cooperate. Those decaying hands trapped inside their gloves revealed a quiet consequence of indulgence carried into adulthood, hidden behind fabric designed to protect reputations rather than skin. This silent deterioration pressed against the boundaries of Victorian restraint, deepening the unease that surrounded masculine identity. Within that carefully maintained exterior lingered a collapse no one dared to acknowledge. Doctors in Victorian England occupied a peculiar position in the world of concealed illness. They were expected to heal, yet they were equally expected to protect reputations, especially those of wealthy or influential men. When a patient arrived with sores along his fingers or lesions creeping across the palm, the doctor often recognized the cause immediately. The signs were familiar: discoloration, tenderness, peeling skin, crooked swelling that made the hand move strangely. But rather than discuss the nature of the disease openly, many physicians chose a gentler, more socially acceptable approach, one that prioritized discretion over clarity. Men who feared exposure often heard the same advice repeated in calm, authoritative tones: keep the hands clean, avoid irritation, and wear gloves as often as possible. The suggestion served both practical and social purposes. Gloves hid the wounds from public view, reducing the risk of embarrassing questions. They also prevented patients from touching infected surfaces or scratching irritated areas. Yet, beneath these medical justifications lay a truth that went unspoken. The gloves protected the man's reputation far more effectively than they protected his health. Doctors knew that their patients valued dignity above cure, and so treatment plans quietly reflected this hierarchy. Medical records for these conditions were often written with deliberate vagueness. A doctor might note dermal irritation, inflammation, or chronic sensitivity, avoiding terms that could spark rumors or tarnish a family name. In wealthy households, a physician might even keep separate ledgers, one for formal documentation and one for private notes that never left his possession. The goal was not deception in the usual sense, but preservation. A man with a respected position in society could not afford an official record of venereal disease, and doctors understood the consequences of allowing such information to circulate. This mutual protection formed a silent pact. Patients trusted doctors to keep their secrets, and doctors relied on that trust to maintain their own reputations. A physician known for discretion attracted more clients. A physician who allowed scandal to escape his office lost business quickly. In this way, the medical profession became tied to the same social pressures that governed its patients. Silence was not a failure. Silence was a service. Some doctors struggled with this expectation. They saw firsthand the suffering caused by untreated disease, the deformities progressing slowly through tissues and joints. They watched men return month after month with worsening symptoms, yet were still reluctant to pursue more aggressive treatment. The men feared the shame of diagnosis more than the danger of illness. By the time they sought real intervention, their hands were often beyond repair. Physicians confronted a dilemma: pressure their patients and risk losing them, or maintain the quiet rituals of Victorian courtesy and allow the decline to continue. Most chose the latter. Consultations took on a careful rhythm. A doctor might examine the hand without fully naming the illness. He might offer ointments, powders, or bandages that soothed symptoms but did little to halt the progression. He might ask gentle questions about pain or mobility, but avoid probing into how the condition developed. Both men pretended not to notice what they both understood. The doctor preserved the patient's dignity. The patient preserved the doctor's standing. In this way, denial became a shared therapeutic practice. Some physicians even tailored their offices to reduce the risk of unwanted exposure. Curtains were drawn during examinations. Assistants were dismissed from the room. Appointments were scheduled at discrete hours, often early mornings or late evenings, to minimize encounters with other patients. The effort to protect the patient's anonymity extended beyond the exam table and into the architecture of daily medical practice. The fear of being seen entering a particular office could be enough to keep a man away entirely. So doctors adapted, ensuring that no one had to explain why they were there. The cultural weight of venereal disease made direct communication nearly impossible. Illness itself carried less stigma than the moral implications attached to it. Admitting to infection felt like confessing to a moral failing. When doctors avoided explicit language, they were not simply sparing feelings. They were conforming to societal rules that punished openness. Their silence allowed patients to continue participating in polite society without confronting the full reality of their condition. From a modern perspective, The hesitancy of Victorian doctors appears deeply flawed. The lack of clear communication delayed treatment, worsened outcomes, and fueled the cycle of concealment. Yet, within the context of their time, these physicians were often acting in the only way their society permitted. To breach a patient's privacy was to destroy his standing. To speak too plainly about the nature of his illness was to risk scandal. In such an environment, silence became a clinical tool, a method of care shaped by expectations rather than evidence. The enduring image is not of doctors failing their patients, but of doctors bound to the same pressures that restrained everyone else. They stood at the threshold between truth and public image, turning a blind eye because their patients demanded it and their culture rewarded it. This quiet cooperation between doctor and patient preserved reputations even as bodies continued to break down, reinforcing a system where discretion mattered more than healing. The unspoken agreement created an atmosphere of controlled denial, shaping the way illness was understood and endured. Inside, that fragile balance grew an unease that would eventually force men to seek other ways to mask the worsening reality beneath their gloves. Gloves that were meant to project refinement often carried the quiet evidence of what their wearers tried hardest to hide. Men who suffered from infections or chronic skin deterioration learned quickly that the surface of the glove could betray them if they were not careful. Dark colors, especially deep blacks and muted browns, became the safest choice. These shades concealed dried blood that seeped through small cracks in the fingertips or the faint shine of fluid that rose from untreated sores. A lighter glove could reveal such stains immediately, turning a private struggle into a public humiliation. Dark gloves allowed men to move through crowded streets and parlors with a sense of control, even when their hands throbbed beneath the fabric. Inside the glove, the reality was far more difficult to manage. Many men discovered that the lining absorbed more than sweat. It captured the residue of illness, thin fluid from open lesions, flakes of irritated skin, and the dampness that came with feverish swelling. To prevent the smell or moisture from escaping, they replaced the linings frequently, sometimes daily. Tailors provided spare inserts that could be tucked into the glove and removed discreetly, meant to preserve both cleanliness and composure. The ritual of changing these linings became part of their morning routine, a private task performed long before anyone else in the household awoke. It was one of the few ways they could maintain the illusion that their hands were still intact. Despite these efforts, the gloves often showed strain in subtler ways. Thick materials that concealed moisture also reduced flexibility, making movements stiff and unnatural. When a man lifted a cup or signed his name, the restrictive fabric pulled against the tender skin underneath, causing micro-movements that revealed discomfort. Observers noticed hesitation or rigid posture, even if they did not understand the cause. Gloves that were too heavy for the season drew additional attention. On warm summer days, when lighter fabrics should have been sufficient, some men wore dense leather or reinforced cloth to disguise the swelling in their fingers. The mismatch between attire and weather created a quiet ripple of suspicion. Certain patterns of wear became recognizable to those who paid attention. A glove with thinning fingertips suggested constant pressure from swollen joints. Uneven stretching across the knuckles hinted at deformities beneath. A faint bulge, where the palm curved, might indicate bandaging hidden inside. Tailors learned to read these signs instinctively, even when their clients said nothing. The gloves delivered the truth in marks and creases, even when the wearer maintained steady composure. For men who feared being discovered, small adjustments became necessary. Some began carrying handkerchiefs not for their faces but for their gloves, dabbing at moisture that threatened to seep through the seams. Others practiced holding their hands in ways that reduced visible strain, keeping them clasped behind their back, resting them on walking sticks, or tucking them into coat pockets. These gestures made movement more predictable and helped avoid situations where someone might notice the rigid outline of a deteriorating finger. In formal settings, the challenge growing beneath the gloves intensified. A handshake could reveal too much through pressure alone. if the fingers beneath were tender or misshapen. The grip became weak or brief, prompting questions a man could not afford to answer. To compensate, some shifted their handshake style, using more wrist movement and less finger engagement. Others avoided handshakes entirely by adopting elaborate bows or polite nods, claiming personal habit or foreign influence. Victorian etiquette, with its intricate rules of behaviour, provided enough flexibility for such evasions to seem ordinary. For those whose conditions had advanced significantly, gloves became both armour and burden. The thicker the glove, the more it traps heat and moisture, causing further irritation to the skin underneath. Removing the glove after a long day often revealed new damage. Skin softened by constant humidity, wounds that deepened from friction, nails that loosened further in the darkness. These discoveries rarely changed a man's behaviour. He continued wearing the gloves because the alternative, exposure, felt unthinkable. From a modern standpoint, the effort involved in maintaining this concealment appears exhausting. Yet for Victorian men, the gloves offered a kind of protection no medical treatment could provide. They allowed the wearer to pass through the world without having to explain himself. They shielded him from gossip, from judgment, and from the fear that someone might look too closely. In a society where appearances defined worth, maintaining the integrity of a glove mattered more than confronting the failing hand inside it. The cycle was self-perpetuating. The more a man's condition worsened, the heavier and more elaborate his gloves became. The more elaborate the gloves, the more scrutinized they were by those around him. Suspicion grew quietly, fed by small inconsistencies and unexplained choices. Yet no one spoke openly about their doubts. Politeness demanded restraint, and curiosity remained unvoiced. The silence preserved the social order. Even as the truth continued, pressing outward from beneath the fabric, the signs etched into those gloves revealed the struggle their wearers fought each day, hinting at decay that no amount of careful stitching could fully contain. Layers of cloth and leather offered temporary protection, but they also amplified the unease surrounding every gesture and movement. Under that carefully maintained surface stretched a tension that would soon require even greater lengths to sustain the illusion of normalcy. Gloves functioned as silent shields in a society where every gesture carried meaning. During social interactions, especially handshakes, they offered a layer of protection far beyond the physical. A handshake in Victorian culture was more than a greeting. It was a subtle declaration of respectability, confidence, and moral standing. For men, hiding damaged or diseased hands, the glove absorbed the scrutiny that would otherwise fall on their skin. The fabric prevented direct contact, softened the grip, and masked hesitation. What would have been an exposing moment became a controlled performance, carried out behind the safety of leather or cloth. No one dared request that a gentleman remove his gloves in public. To do so would violate the norms that kept Victorian society operating smoothly. Gloves were part of the ritual of appearance, and interrupting that ritual implied suspicion or impropriety. People avoided such confrontations because the social cost of questioning a man's presentation was too high. Even if someone noticed stiffness in a handshake or unusual thickness in the glove material, politeness required silence. The glove thus became a weapon, not aggressive, but defensive, allowing men to maintain authority without inviting investigation. This unspoken agreement between wearer and observer created an environment where gloves obscured far more than disease. They hid weakness of all kinds, trembling caused by exhaustion, burns from industrial accidents, stiffness from arthritis, or shaking induced by fear. A man could attend a formal dinner, raise a glass, or greet a colleague without revealing that his hands were no longer reliable. The glove transformed vulnerability into composure. In a culture that valued self-control above honesty, this transformation felt necessary. The most striking aspect of this concealment was how easy it became for others to overlook. Politeness encouraged people not to look too closely. The neat fit, polished black sheen, and smooth stitching suggested discipline and refinement. Those who saw the gloves often interpreted them as signs of elegance rather than barriers. The illusion worked because people preferred not to consider uncomfortable possibilities. A gentleman's outward grace mattered more than his physical reality, and gloves helped maintain that fiction. In professional settings, gloves carried even more weight. A man in business or politics relied on perception to maintain influence. The handshake became a tactical exchange, an opportunity to demonstrate confidence while revealing nothing. Men learned to manage the sensation of pain beneath the glove by adjusting their grip, applying pressure with the wrist instead of the fingers, or shortening the handshake just enough to avoid strain without appearing abrupt. These small adaptations protected both reputation and physical endurance. The glove served as a mediator between expectation and capability. The notion of questioning a man's gloves violated deeply held social codes. Gloves were considered personal and integral to a gentleman's identity. Just as no one would demand a man remove his coat or hat in the street, no one would ask him to expose his hands. This cultural boundary shielded men who needed that protection most. They relied on the social discomfort surrounding such requests, knowing that their gloves could remain in place indefinitely without challenge. At social gatherings, the gloves created a strange symmetry. Men wore them not only because they needed to hide illness, but because everyone else wore them too. The uniformity allowed diseased hands to blend into the crowd. No one could distinguish between those who wore gloves for etiquette and those who wore them for survival. The blending reinforced the idea that appearance mattered more than truth. When all hands looked the same, no one had reason to wonder what lay beneath. This shared illusion deepened as the glove became a symbol of gentlemanly composure. Hosts expected their guests to arrive gloved. Artists painted portraits of men with their gloves displayed prominently, emphasizing refinement. Writers described gloves as markers of civilization and propriety. These cultural narratives allowed men to hide behind a symbol widely celebrated for reasons unrelated to illness. The glove's protective function was strengthened by the admiration it received. From a modern viewpoint, the dynamic resembles the way people today use social norms to hide personal struggles. Where modern individuals might rely on digital filters, Victorian men relied on leather. Both tools transform perception without addressing the underlying truth. The glove's ability to protect dignity, even when the body failed, made it indispensable. Men who feared their hands might betray them clung to gloves as if they were a final barrier between their inner decay and the world's judgment. Yet the effectiveness of gloves in guarding a man's image carried its own quiet cost. The constant concealment prevented healing because avoiding exposure felt safer than seeking treatment. Men lived with the paradox of appearing whole while knowing that their hands were deteriorating beneath the surface. The more their condition worsened, the tighter they held onto their gloves. Over time, the glove became not only a shield, but a reminder of the fragility of the dignity it protected. Gloved hands allowed men to move through society while hiding truths that would have shattered their carefully tended image of respectability. Each handshake preserved a fiction, reinforcing a polished facade that discouraged scrutiny. Inside that borrowed confidence gathered a deeper tension, urging men toward even greater reliance on the very fabric meant to hide their decline. Marriage in Victorian society carried expectations that extended far beyond companionship. A man was expected to project stability, health, and authority, even when his body no longer supported those ideals. For men suffering from hidden infections or progressive deterioration of the hands, marriage became another stage on which concealment was mandatory. The glove, which had already served as a shield in public, took on an even more intimate role inside the home, preserving appearances that held families together and reputations intact. Many men entered marriage while fully aware that their condition was worsening. The engagement period offered opportunities for close interaction, yet gloves remained a constant presence, A future wife might wonder why her fiancé seemed reluctant to reveal his bare hands, but she rarely questioned it aloud. Victorian modesty discouraged such inquiries, and women were taught to respect a gentleman's privacy. The glove allowed a man to appear whole, au capable, and unblemished. It ensured that his illness remained invisible long enough for the marriage to proceed without suspicion. Inside the home, the rules of concealment grew even stricter. A wife was not permitted to see her husband's hands under clear light if he could avoid it. Candles were dimmed, curtains drawn, and certain gestures limited to shadowed corners. What should have been a shared domestic space became a carefully controlled environment where the man managed every movement to protect his secret. The glove acted as a boundary, allowing him to maintain authority while avoiding explanations he feared he could not give. During moments of intimacy, the emotional distance created by the glove became more pronounced. The expectation that a wife should remain unaware of her husband's condition made physical closeness strangely rigid. The fabric created a barrier between bodies, transforming touch into something muted and cautious. For some men, the glove offered relief by preventing direct skin contact, which could irritate open sores or expose fragile tissue. For others, it was a constant reminder that their illness followed them even into the most private parts of their life. The wedding night, often imagined as a moment of vulnerability and revelation, became an exercise in choreography. A man whose hands showed signs of disease controlled the lighting, the pace, and the positions, ensuring that his gloves never slipped or drew attention. The sound of fabric brushing against linen replaced the warmth of skin against skin. A wife might notice the stiffness of his touch or the unusual caution in his movements, but she learned to interpret these behaviors through the lens of modesty rather than suspicion. Victorian culture valued ignorance as a form of purity, and silence was seen as a virtue. This veil of privacy extended beyond the bedroom. At the breakfast table, a husband might hold his utensils with unusual precision to minimize pressure. When reading, he might keep one hand tucked beneath the other. If a glove needed adjusting, he waited until he was alone. The constant vigilance required to protect the illusion eroded comfort within the marriage. Yet the facade endured because both husband and wife were bound by social expectations that discouraged confrontation. Wives in these situations often sensed that something was amiss long before they understood the extent of it. They noticed the reluctance to remove gloves, the aversion to bright light, or the discomfort that flickered across a husband's expression when his hand was accidentally brushed. But Victorian women were raised in a world where questioning a man's physical or moral condition bordered on impropriety. The social imbalance kept them silent, even when confusion turned to fear. This silence could be devastating. Many women contracted illnesses from husbands who refused to reveal their condition. Skin-to-skin contact might have been limited, but other forms of intimacy carried risks that neither spouse fully understood. When symptoms eventually appeared in wives or newborn children, families attributed the suffering to fate or divine will. Rarely did anyone consider that the cause had been concealed beneath layers of fabric from the beginning. The obligation to maintain an image of marital harmony further deepened the quiet. Husbands depended on their wives' ignorance to preserve the household's stability, and wives depended on the marriage to secure their place in society. The glove thus became a symbol of the fragile compromise binding them together. It shielded the husband from exposure and shielded the wife from truths she was never given the chance to confront. To modernize, the idea of wearing gloves during intimate moments feels unsettling, even surreal. Yet in the Victorian context, it aligned perfectly with a culture that prized restraint, denied bodily imperfection, and equated personal worth with moral appearance. The glove did not merely hide disease, it protected an entire social system that relied on secrecy to function. Over time, the presence of the glove in marriage became so normalized that wives stopped questioning it, and husbands stopped imagining life without it. The glove offered continuity, a sense of control in a world that demanded flawless behavior. But beneath that quiet surface lay fear, shame, and a growing awareness that the concealment could not last forever. The gloves that shielded men from judgment also shaped the intimacy of their homes, turning private relationships into carefully managed performances. This protection allowed marriages to function smoothly, while hiding decay that neither partner dared name. Behind that strained closeness gathered a deeper uncertainty, one that would reveal itself more clearly as the social consequences of disease continued to spread. Handshakes in Victorian society carried a weight far greater than a simple greeting. They symbolized trust, agreement, and mutual respect. Gestures meant to affirm a man's standing among his peers. Yet for men whose hands were already succumbing to decay, each handshake became a quiet ordeal. Beneath the glove, the fingers often stiffened from advanced infection, joints swelling until they locked into place. Despite the pain, these men continued attending meetings, dinners, and public events, determined to maintain an image of strength even as their bodies betrayed them. The grip they offered felt unmistakably different. Where a healthy hand carried warmth and movement, theirs felt cold, rigid, and strangely detached. The glove softened the impression, but could not completely disguise the absence of vitality beneath. Those who received such a handshake sometimes sensed something unsettling but did not name it. Victorian etiquette discouraged drawing attention to physical abnormalities, and politeness often replaced genuine inquiry. Silence allowed the gesture to pass unchallenged, even when the truth lay moments beneath discovery. As the disease progressed, the transformation inside the glove became more severe. The fingertips hardened, nails lifted or fell away, and the palm grew increasingly insensitive. The glove served as a final frame that held together what the body could not. Men adjusted their grip to avoid exposing their condition, pressing with the side of the hand or engaging only the wrist. These adaptations appeared courteous, perhaps even refined, but they masked the physical limitations that controlled their movements. The facade depended entirely on the glove's ability to prevent others from feeling the collapse inside. In formal gatherings, the meaning of the handshake deepened. A man whose role required diplomacy or public presence could not simply withdraw from social expectations. He extended his gloved hand again and again, each time risking exposure. Beneath the surface, the coldness of the flesh revealed how far the illness had advanced. The glove trapped no warmth, it only preserved shape. Those closest to him, colleagues, acquaintances, even family members, often chose to interpret the chill as a symptom of the weather or the stiffness of the material. Few allowed themselves to imagine the truth. Some men continued these rituals until their final days. They attended meetings long after their bodies weakened, performing the motions that society demanded of them. The handshake became an act of defiance against the decline they could no longer control. Even when the pain sharpened or the fingers ceased to bend, the glove allowed them to maintain the illusion of competence. They persisted because stepping back meant acknowledging what they had spent years concealing. The glove granted them temporary victories. Small, fleeting moments where dignity outweighed deterioration. In households where illness progressed rapidly, families sometimes grew aware of the condition despite the men's efforts. They noticed how long it took to remove the gloves at night, how carefully the hands were shielded from view, and how often new pairs were purchased. Yet even within families, confrontation rarely occurred. Victorian ideals prized restraint, and many wives or children accepted the silence surrounding the disease. They watched the progression in shadows, learning to recognize the signs without pointing to them. The most haunting detail was how long men kept their gloves on, until the very end. Some were known to wear gloves even as they lay in their final hours, refusing to let their hands be exposed to the room. The glove had become part of their identity, a final protection against judgment. When death came, the glove remained. Relatives sometimes honored the man's unspoken wish by leaving the gloves in place as his body was prepared. Mourners who attended the funeral might see hands folded neatly over the chest, gloved as they had always been in life. They rarely questioned the choice. The idea that a handshake could serve as a farewell carries a quiet weight. For many of these men, their final handshakes occurred without anyone realizing it. The moment felt ordinary, a polite greeting, a brief exchange, a movement repeated countless times. Yet behind that gesture lingered a truth the men could not voice. They had continued the ritual not only to protect their reputation, but also to maintain a sense of belonging in a world that expected them to remain strong. To modern eyes, these handshakes seem like acts of desperation, attempts to maintain dignity in the face of overwhelming decline. But in the Victorian mindset, appearance shaped identity. A man was defined not by his suffering but by his composure. The glove offered him a way to fulfill that expectation until the final moment. He extended his arm in greeting. The handshakes these men offered carried echoes of decline that no one dared confront, preserving dignity through a gesture meant to hide rather than reveal. This ritual allowed them to remain present even as their bodies failed, enabling a quiet farewell repeated in every meeting. Around that final insistence on composure grew a deeper truth that would eventually reach beyond the individual and into the broader social world that encouraged such silence. In professional and political circles, gloves served as more than accessories. They functioned as quiet guarantees of credibility. Men who occupied positions of influence, politicians, attorneys, and industrial directors, were expected to embody discipline and moral clarity. Even when their private lives told a different story, their gloves became part of their public identity, reinforcing the idea that their hands were unmarked, steady, and fully capable of guiding others. The smooth leather suggested confidence, precision, and cleanliness, offering reassurance to those who relied on their decisions. Many of these men had reasons to maintain such illusions. Their responsibilities required constant contact with colleagues, clerks, and supporters. A handshake could form alliances, settle disputes, or finalize agreements. Yet, touching another person's skin directly posed risks not only of physical discomfort, but of revealing symptoms they desperately needed to hide. The glove created an acceptable barrier, one that protected them from both infection and exposure. It allowed them to participate in the rituals of leadership without inviting questions they could not answer. Meetings often involved long hours in close quarters, but the presence of gloves prevented others from noticing the subtle tremors or stiffness that signaled illness. A man who struggled to bend his fingers could disguise the limitation by selecting tailored gloves that held shape for him. Even lifting documents or signing contracts became easier when the material cushioned the weakened joints. Observers interpreted these gestures as signs of appropriate conduct rather than symptoms of degradation. The glove's ability to mask deterioration became indispensable to maintaining authority. In political halls, gloves played an even more pronounced role. A public servant was expected to embody strength, decisiveness, and control, qualities incompatible with the fragility of diseased hands. A politician whose fingers had begun to decay could not afford the shock or pity such a sight would provoke. He relied on gloves, not merely for discretion but for survival in his career. A single glimpse of deformity could undermine trust, invite opponents to question his competence, or fuel rumors about moral failings associated with venereal disease. The glove protected him from scrutiny and preserved the image essential to his influence. The irony of this situation was rarely acknowledged. These same men often argued for moral reform, urged citizens to maintain purity, or enforce strict social codes that punished the very behaviors they privately engaged in. Their gloves concealed not only physical decline, but also the contradictions of their public stance. They enforced standards they themselves could not meet, relying on layers of leather to hide the disparity between their ideals and their actions. The contrast between their polished exterior and concealed illness became a quiet reflection of the broader hypocrisy embedded in Victorian society. In offices and courtrooms, gloves allowed men to maintain control, even in situations that demanded close interaction. An attorney might gesture confidently while arguing a case, using his gloved hands to reinforce his points. A director might sign orders with steady movements made possible only by the rigidity of the glove. Workers and subordinates observing these actions rarely considered that the hands performing them might be compromised. The glove functioned as a mask, enabling roles that would otherwise be threatened by physical weakness. The demand for gloves in professional spaces even shaped the culture of workplaces. It became common to see men removing their hats and coats while leaving their gloves on, a reversal of what might be expected in less formal settings. The glove symbolized readiness, authority, and separation from manual labor. Removing it would have suggested vulnerability or a lapse in discipline. Thus, men kept their gloves in place as long as they remained in positions where they could be seen, often removing them only when behind locked doors or in the privacy of their own homes. The concealment extended beyond the individual. Institutions relied on the appearance of strong leadership. Industrial boards, law chambers, and political committees preferred not to acknowledge the illnesses of their members. To question a man's physical capability risked destabilizing the group's image or exposing internal weaknesses. As a result, colleagues often ignored signs of deterioration, interpreting stiffness or unusual gestures as quirks rather than symptoms. The glove allowed everyone, wearer and observer alike, to maintain the illusion that nothing was amiss. This collective denial had consequences. Decisions affecting thousands were sometimes made by men whose health was rapidly failing, their judgment clouded by pain or fever. Yet the appearance of authority persisted, reinforced by the gloves that kept the truth hidden. Victorian society valued presentation so deeply that the integrity of its institutions depended, in part, on the concealment of its leaders' physical realities. The glove became a symbol of that concealed fragility, a reminder that the foundations of power were not always as solid as they appeared. From a modern standpoint, the reliance on gloves in professional and political life seems almost theatrical, yet the performance was necessary. Without the glove, the facade of authority might have crumbled, revealing the frailty beneath. The glove maintained stability, not through strength, but through concealment. The gloves that shaped professional identity allowed men to uphold authority while their bodies deteriorated beneath the surface. Preserving influence at the cost of honesty, this quiet dependence created a veneer of stability, even as decay threatened to undermine the structures they led. Through that widening gap between appearance and reality emerged a fragile tension that would deepen as the pressures of concealment continued to mount. The burden of wearing gloves extended beyond the physical strain of concealing damaged hands. Over time, the constant need to hide signs of illness began to erode the emotional stability of those who relied on the gloves most. Men who once felt secure behind polished leather gradually found themselves trapped by it, their sense of self narrowing to the fragile boundary between what the glove concealed and what the world must never see. The act of covering their hands, initially a practical measure, slowly transformed into a daily reminder of vulnerability, shame, and the fear of exposure. For many, the psychological toll manifested as a persistent unease that accompanied every gesture. Even simple movements became moments of tension. Picking up a glass, turning a door handle, or signing a document required careful control to ensure that no gap revealed the skin beneath. Each action repeated the same quiet message: you must not let them see. This vigilance gradually shaped their thoughts, creating a mental landscape defined by anticipation and fear. The glove no longer felt like protection. It felt like a prison. Some men fell deeply into this pattern, developing anxieties that followed them into the night. They began wearing their gloves to bed, unable to relax unless the fabric remained in place. The gesture served no practical purpose. No one watched them as they slept, Yet the compulsion persisted because the glove had become intertwined with their identity. Removing it meant confronting the reality of their condition, a sight they themselves often avoided. The darkness of the room did nothing to soften the shock of seeing their bare hands, so they chose not to see them at all. The emotional isolation that accompanied this routine was profound. Victorian ideals taught men to mask vulnerability, making it nearly impossible for them to reveal their struggle, even to their families. A man might sit beside his wife at the dinner table, his gloves in place, his posture controlled. Yet inside he fought a growing sense of collapse. He could not confide in her without admitting the truth he had spent years hiding. The silence widened the distance between them, leaving him alone in the midst of his own household. As their conditions worsened, some men grew convinced that their decaying hands symbolized a deeper failure within themselves. Disease carried moral implications in Victorian society, and many interpreted their affliction as evidence of personal weakness or wrongdoing. The glove, meant to preserve dignity, reinforced this belief by reminding them of what they had become. Every time they tugged the fabric tighter or examined the wear along the seams, they confronted the evidence of their body's decline. The glove did not protect their pride. It slowly dismantled it. The psychological strain extended into the workplace. Men in positions of authority feared that any lapse in their performance might hint at the illness they struggled to conceal. They worried that colleagues would notice their rigid posture or the way they favored one hand over the other. These concerns followed them through meetings, correspondence, and public appearances. The constant self-monitoring left them exhausted, unable to trust their own composure. The glove symbolized not confidence, but the fragility of their professional standing. Social gatherings intensified the pressure. A man who once enjoyed conversation and company might find himself retreating into silence, afraid that a gesture or handshake could expose him. He learned to stand at the edges of rooms, keeping his hands carefully positioned. His smile remained polite, but his thoughts circled the same fears. Over time, the isolation shaped his personality, turning him cautious where he had once been bold, withdrawn where he had once been sociable. Some men experienced the breakdown more dramatically. Panic rose whenever someone reached toward their hand unexpectedly. Dreams replayed moments where the glove slipped, revealing the decay beneath. Waking from such visions left them trembling, reaching instinctively to ensure the gloves remained tight. The boundary between caution and obsession blurred, and the glove became inseparable from their sense of safety. Without it, they felt exposed, not only physically, but emotionally, as though the glove shielded parts of themselves they could not bear to confront. In the final stages of illness, the psychological deterioration sometimes surpassed the physical suffering. Men withdrew from their families, avoided mirrors, and refused to discuss their health. Their world narrowed to the space inside the glove, where they attempted to contain both disease and shame. The sense of identity that once centered on work, status, and respect slowly condensed into fear of being seen. The glove became the last structure holding them together, even as it contributed to their unraveling. From a modern perspective, the emotional collapse tied to wearing gloves may seem extreme. Yet in the Victorian world, where disease was moralized, reputation was everything, and vulnerability was rarely permitted, the glove carried enormous symbolic weight. It allowed men to function while silently undermining their confidence. The same fabric that hid their wounds also magnified their fear of exposure, turning every day into a negotiation between the image they projected and the truth they concealed. The gloves that once offered comfort eventually tightened around their sense of self, eroding confidence as thoroughly as illness eroded flesh. The pressure to maintain appearances left men trapped between the need to hide and the despair of isolation. Through that growing strain emerged a deeper fracture, one that shaped not only their emotions, but the choices they made as their condition continued to progress. Death in Victorian England often arrived quietly. slipping into homes already accustomed to sickness. Yet among men who concealed their illnesses beneath gloves, death sometimes began in the smallest and least suspected place. The hand. What started as a sore hidden under leather or cloth could progress unnoticed until infection spread beyond the fingers, reaching deeper tissues and eventually the bloodstream. The man continued his routines, presenting himself as composed and capable, while beneath the glove a slow collapse unfolded. Because these injuries were concealed, treatment rarely came in time. A man, determined to maintain his dignity, avoided exposing his hand even to his doctor, offering only vague descriptions of pain, swelling, or stiffness, without seeing the wound directly. The physician provided mild remedies, salves meant to soothe, a bandage meant to protect, but these were insufficient against infections that required immediate and forceful intervention. Days passed as the condition worsened. The skin split further, the tissue darkened, and the pain deepened into something sharp and persistent. Still, the glove remained in place. Victorian medicine lacked the tools to combat severe infection effectively, but early action could sometimes prevent fatal outcomes. Unfortunately, men who relied on concealment surrendered that chance. They wore gloves at meetings, dinners, walks, and gatherings, allowing the constant pressure and humidity to aggravate the wound. The enclosed space became an ideal environment for bacteria to flourish. Eventually, fever emerged, chills followed, and fatigue settled into their bodies. Yet these symptoms were often attributed to overwork or seasonal illness, rather than the hidden injury beneath the glove. At home, family members sometimes sensed the change before the man acknowledged it. His movements slowed, his voice weakened, his appetite faded. Still, he clung to the glove, insisting on maintaining the image he believed essential to his identity. Even when he could no longer write steadily or lift objects without trembling, he avoided removing it. The glove had become part of him, an extension of the self he wanted others to see. To reveal the hand now felt like admitting to a moral failing rather than a medical one. When the infection reached a critical stage, the physical signs became difficult to ignore. Red streaks sometimes travelled up the arm, the body's warning that the illness had entered the bloodstream. The fever intensified until he could no longer stand or speak comfortably. At this point, the glove served no purpose beyond preserving the last shreds of dignity. He kept it on even in bed, even when the fabric stuck to his skin, even when the pressure caused unbearable pain. Removing it meant acknowledging the truth, and he refused. Families called physicians when the suffering became too severe to hide. But by then, the outcome was almost certain. As the doctor gently peeled away the glove, the room often fell silent. Beneath the fabric lay a hand that no one, not even the man himself, had fully seen for weeks or months. The sight was shocking. Blackened fingertips, swollen joints, deep lesions oozing faint traces of infected fluid. The smell confirmed what words could not. The doctor understood immediately that the infection had travelled too far. In many cases, death followed within days. The man drifted in and out of consciousness, speaking little, gripping nothing. During these final hours, the glove sometimes remained on his other hand, the one less damaged, as if preserving one last piece of the image he had worked so hard to maintain. Even as he slipped further from the world, he clung to the idea that concealment had protected him. In truth, it had hastened the end. The tragedy of these deaths lay not only in their preventability, but in the isolation that surrounded them. The man died with parts of himself unknown to those closest to him. His wife never saw the true state of his injured hand until it was too late. His children remembered him as distant in his final days, unaware that he hid his suffering not from them, but from the judgment he feared society would place upon him. The glove had enabled him to keep this secret until the very end. For the families left behind, the shock lingered. They wondered how something so small, so easily concealed, could lead to such devastation. They searched for meaning in the silence that had surrounded his decline. Victorian society offered no answers. The culture prized composure above vulnerability, appearance above truth. A man who hid his illness was seen as upholding dignity, even if doing so cost him his life. Modern observers might view these deaths as senseless, yet they fit seamlessly into the values of the time. A gentleman's reputation was considered worth more than his health, and the glove became both his shield and his downfall. Concealment allowed him to move through society without shame, but it also denied him the chance to confront his illness before it consumed him. The quiet deaths that began in their hands revealed how deeply men relied on concealment, allowing infection to spread while they protected their image. The glove preserved dignity, even as it trapped the very decay that threatened their lives. From that final insistence on hiding emerged a truth that exposed the fragile boundaries between pride, denial, and mortality. In the working districts of Victorian towns, hands were visible whether their owners wished it or not. Labourers, factory boys, coal shovelers, dock workers. None of them possessed the means to hide their injuries. Their hands bore the marks of daily survival, cuts from tools, burns from machinery, swollen joints from repetition, and infections that spread unchecked. When disease touched them, it appeared plainly for all to see. There were no gloves to soften the shock, no polished leather to disguise wounds, no fabric to transform decay into something acceptable. Their bodies told their stories without mercy. A labourer whose fingers darkened from infection had little opportunity to conceal his condition. The workplace demanded constant use of the hands, and any attempt to hide them risked dismissal. Illness meant lost wages, and lost wages meant hunger. The progression from injury to deformity happened under the gaze of co-workers and employers who rarely offered help beyond a curt command to keep working. In overcrowded tenements, neighbours watched the deterioration unfold as well, their sympathy limited by the knowledge that such suffering was common and unavoidable. Disease among the poor was treated as an expected hazard, not a tragedy. By contrast, wealthier men used gloves to buy silence. The same infection that would expose a worker to ridicule or unemployment could be hidden almost indefinitely by those who could afford tailored gloves. Discreet physicians and private routines. Money purchased not only material protection, but also social permission to hide one's decline. A gentleman might attend dinners, meet political allies, or oversee business affairs while his hands slowly deteriorated in secret. His illness remained invisible, insulated by etiquette and the assumption that a man of his status could not possibly suffer from ailments associated with impurity or moral failing. This disparity extended to medical treatment. While the poor visited crowded clinics or relied on home remedies, wealthy men received confidential visits from physicians who softened diagnoses and avoided any language that might tarnish reputations. The doctor's discretion served as another layer of protection, a privilege unavailable to those whose lives unfolded in public view. A worker with a diseased hand might be mocked, pitied, or reprimanded. A gentleman with the same condition was shielded by the very fabric he wore. In the streets, the contrast was even more visible. Labourers carried their injuries openly, wrapped in stained cloth, exposed to the air, or simply ignored due to necessity. People passed them without remark, accustomed to the sight of damaged hands. But the gloves of the upper class presented a different image entirely. Smooth, dark, immaculate, they implied control, health, and discipline. Even when the hands beneath were collapsing, a stranger meeting a gloved gentleman would never guess that the decay under the surface mirrored, or exceeded, the suffering of the labourers he walked past. The symbolism embedded in these gloves became unmistakable. For the wealthy, gloves offered a way to escape the scrutiny that defined the lives of the working poor. They transformed illness into something private, respectable, and unthreatening. For labourers, the absence of gloves forced every ailment into public view, subject to judgment and neglect. The glove thus became more than a garment. It became a social boundary, dividing those permitted to conceal their suffering from those compelled to display it. This divide shaped how society interpreted disease. When a working man fell ill, the cause was often attributed to carelessness, immorality, or weakness. When a gentleman fell ill, the cause was softened into circumstance, fatigue, or unfortunate misfortune. The glove reinforced these assumptions, allowing upper-class men to move through the world without facing the moral accusations that accompanied visible signs of illness. Their concealment shaped the narrative, shielding them from blame while exposing others to it. The inequality extended into how death itself was perceived. A labourer dying from an untreated infection left behind visibly ravaged hands, evidence of hardship that friends and neighbours understood too well. A gentleman dying from the same cause might leave behind a pair of gloves, still pristine, folded on his bedside table or resting upon his chest. The glove concealed not only the disease but the suffering that preceded it, rewriting the story of his decline into something more dignified and acceptable. From a modern viewpoint, the contrast underscores how profoundly appearance dictated worth in Victorian society. The ability to hide illness became a privilege, and the inability to hide it became a burden. Gloves offered protection not just from scrutiny, but from the social consequences of being visibly unwell. They reinforced the belief that dignity belonged to those who could afford it, while the poor remained exposed to the full judgment of their world. The visible suffering of the poor and the concealed decay of the wealthy revealed a system where illness was interpreted through class rather than reality. Gloves granted protection and silence to those who could buy them, turning health into a marker of privilege instead of circumstance. Out of this stark divide grew a deeper awareness of how appearance shaped morality, leaving the truth buried beneath leather in one world and painfully exposed in the other. Victorian portraits present a world of elegance, or refinement, and perfect composure. Men in tailored suits pose beside carved furniture, their gloves smooth and immaculate, resting lightly on canes or folded across their chests. The paintings and early photographs capture stillness, symmetry, and dignity, qualities the era valued above almost everything else. Yet these images tell only a curated portion of the truth. They show what society wished to remember, not what it chose to ignore. Behind every polished representation lay private realities that no artist or photographer would ever include. The gloves featured so prominently in these portraits served a purpose far deeper than fashion. They hid hands that many men could not risk exposing. Beneath leather or silk might lie fingers stiffened by infection, skin inflamed by disease, or nails loosened from decay. Yet viewers of the time rarely questioned the presence of gloves. Just as modern observers rarely imagine what the gloves might have concealed, the visual record flattened experience into a uniform ideal, erasing the signs of suffering that existed beyond the frame. This omission shaped the way history remembers Victorian masculinity. Men appear steady, controlled, and morally unshakable, figures who represent the height of decorum. But the truth beneath the fabric reveals a contradiction. Many of these same men lived with pain, fear, and shame hidden beneath accessories designed to protect their reputations. Glove-wearing became so entrenched in their daily lives that the concealment itself became invisible. The more a man hid, the more convincingly he appeared strong. Artists contributed to this illusion. Portrait painters softened every detail, smoothing wrinkles and refining textures until the gloves appeared pure and untouched. The sharp smell of infection, the stiffness of rotting fingers, the discoloration hidden by lining, None of these details entered the canvas. Early photographers, 2. Captured only the surface. Long exposure times forced subjects to hold still, and gloves helped stabilize their hands, preventing tremors from blurring the image. The resulting photographs suggested control, even when the body beneath the gloves was failing. Within private households, these portraits became treasured objects, symbols of status and continuity. Families hung them above fireplaces, displayed them in parlors, and passed them down through generations. No one mentioned the illnesses that shaped the real hands behind the scenes. Instead, the images reinforced the narrative of stability and respectability. Children and grandchildren grew up believing their ancestors lived unblemished lives, unaware that silence had replaced truth long before the portrait was made. Public memory followed the same pattern. Historians studying these images often focus on clothing, posture, architecture, or social context. Rarely do they consider the physical realities hidden beneath accessories. Gloves appear as markers of refinement, not as shields against exposure. The absence of visible suffering in the visual record creates the impression that only the poor experienced physical hardship, while the wealthy lived untouched. Yet the gloves themselves tell another story, one of private decay carefully contained beneath layers of fabric. When imagining these men in their daily routines, the contrast becomes sharper. A businessman signing contracts with stiff fingertips, a politician gripping a podium while infection burns beneath his glove, a father holding his child while hiding every trace of pain. None of these scenes appear in portraits. The images freeze a version of truth that aligns with the values of the time, leaving the deeper reality to be quietly forgotten. This historical silence carries consequences. Without acknowledging the suffering concealed behind gloves, the narrative of Victorian strength becomes incomplete. It suggests that dignity came naturally, rather than through constant, deliberate effort. It also hides the moral dimension of concealment, how society rewarded appearance over honesty, and how men participated in a system that punished vulnerability. The gloves in portraits were not simply decorations, they were tools of both survival and denial. Modern viewers must look beyond the surface to interpret these images fully. A glove resting lightly on a book might conceal a hand ravaged by untreated infection. A confident pose might mask the fear of being discovered. The absence of visible decay does not mean it did not exist. It simply means it went unrecorded. History remembers the polished exterior because that is what it was given, not because it was complete. What remains most striking is the deliberate selectiveness of the visual archive. The polished gloves in these images seem timeless, immune to wear or damage. They reflect a world that prized the appearance of purity, even as life beneath that surface told a different story. The portraits remain silent, but the silence reveals limitations embedded in how the era chose to represent itself. The elegant images left behind preserved a version of Victorian life that concealed far more than it disclosed, leaving illness erased by the smooth sheen of leather and silk. These portraits shaped the memory of an age that preferred beauty to truth, encouraging viewers to trust the surface without questioning what it hid. From within this selective record arose a fragile vision of dignity that ignored the decay quietly unfolding beneath the gloves. Victorian society prided itself on restraint, propriety, and the careful management of appearances. In this world, certain truths were permitted to exist only in silence, acknowledged privately, but never spoken aloud. Venereal disease belonged to that category. Everyone understood its presence. Whispers circulated, patterns repeated themselves, and the consequences appeared in households across every district. But conversation about it was forbidden. The topic breached the delicate facade of morality that the era worked so hard to maintain. To name the illness aloud was to admit that the polished veneer of society hid behaviors it publicly condemned. Men who suffered from such conditions understood the unspoken rule instinctively. They avoided any reference to their symptoms, even when the pain disrupted their sleep or the infection weakened their bodies. They learned to navigate conversations carefully, sidestepping topics that might invite uncomfortable questions. The glove became part of this controlled silence. It prevented others from seeing the physical evidence of disease, transforming what could have been a visible sign into a concealed burden. The glove shielded them not only from scrutiny, but from the possibility of discussion itself. Households adopted the same pattern of denial. Wives observed their husbands' discomfort and the way they protected their hands, but they refrained from asking questions. Victorian ideals praised women who were modest, patient, and obedient. To inquire too deeply into a husband's health risked implying moral suspicion, an accusation that could disrupt the structure of the family. Silence became a form of loyalty, even when fear or confusion lingered in the background. Children grew up in homes where illness was present, yet unacknowledged, learning early that some truths were never meant to be spoken. Medical professionals participated in this culture as well. Doctors often recognized the signs of venereal disease immediately, yet they hesitated to label it openly. Euphemisms replaced diagnosis, and treatment plans were delivered in careful, non-committal language. The physician protected his patient's reputation by avoiding clarity, and the patient protected himself by refusing to ask for it. This mutual avoidance reinforced the social belief that propriety mattered more than health. The disease existed in the shadows, where no one was held accountable for speaking plainly. In public life, the silence extended even further. Conversations in parlors, clubs, and gentlemen's societies revolved around politics, literature, and moral philosophy, never touching upon the conditions quietly affecting many of the men present. To mention venereal disease was to acknowledge that respected figures had engaged in behaviors that contradicted the values they publicly upheld. The tension between public virtue and private reality remained unspoken yet palpable, shaping interactions in ways few were willing to admit. The glove served as the perfect symbol of this paradox. Smooth, elegant, and entirely devoted to the concealment of truth. This unwillingness to confront illness had lasting consequences. Men delayed seeking help, fearing judgment more than physical decline. They interpreted symptoms as temporary inconveniences rather than signs of progressive infection. The secrecy surrounding the disease obscured its causes, allowing misconceptions to flourish. Some believed the condition resulted from poor air quality or contaminated water, while others attributed it to moral weakness, reinforcing shame that prevented them from seeking treatment. The glove offered temporary reassurance, but did nothing to address the illness beneath, allowing infections to spread silently within households and communities. The pressure to maintain silence also shaped how men understood themselves. Suffering became a private experience, endured without support or acknowledgement. The more severe the symptoms grew, the more fiercely they guarded their secret. They relied on gloves, dim lighting, and careful movements to preserve the illusion of health. Over time, the act of concealment became so habitual that the truth felt distant, almost unreal, except in moments of pain. In this way, the disease affected both body and identity, creating a form of moral isolation that mirrored the physical deterioration. In broader society, this culture of denial enabled the continuation of a moral narrative that never reflected reality. The upper classes portrayed themselves as paragons of restraint, while quietly tolerating behaviors that contributed to widespread illness. The refusal to discuss disease publicly allowed the myth of superiority to persist, separating the respectable from the condemned, not through conduct, but through the ability to hide consequences. The glove became the instrument of that separation, sealing away what society refused to acknowledge. Modern observers might find this silence bewildering, but within the Victorian context, it made perfect sense. A society built upon appearances required tools that protected its illusions. The glove, by concealing what lay beneath, reinforced the belief that morality was visible and that anything hidden could not damage one's reputation. This logic created a world where truth mattered less than perception, and where suffering continued quietly, unnoticed except by those who bore it. The refusal to speak openly about disease allowed men to maintain reputations built on fragile illusions, hiding physical decline behind accessories valued more than honesty. This silence shaped families, professions, and public life, reinforcing a culture where concealment passed for virtue. Into that carefully guarded quiet spread a deeper instability, revealing how much the society relied on denial to preserve its sense of order. Shops that appeared ordinary from the street often held quiet arrangements beneath their polished surfaces, behind curtains, in locked back rooms, or under the pretense of tailoring services. Certain merchants offered items never listed on their ledgers. These gloves did not exist for elegance or seasonal fashion. They served men who needed a barrier stronger than satin and more discreet than medical treatment. To the casual observer, they looked like refined accessories designed to complement a gentleman's attire. Yet their construction followed a different purpose: concealment, absorption, and silence. The men who sought these gloves arrived at odd hours, often choosing entrances that avoided the main street. They preferred to be greeted quickly and quietly, avoiding any interaction that might draw attention. Their transactions relied on mutual understanding rather than conversation. No one stated what the gloves were for. Yet both parties recognized the necessity. The price reflected not only craftsmanship, but the cost of secrecy. These gloves were purchased with urgency and worn with dread, each pair a testament to a private struggle that could never be spoken aloud. Merchants who participated in this trade understood the risks. Selling medical gloves disguised as fashion accessories violated regulations and threatened their reputations. Yet the demand was strong and the profit undeniable. Some shops operated entirely at night, limiting access to clients who had proven their discretion. Others maintained an official storefront for regular customers while storing their illicit inventory in compartments hidden behind shelves or beneath floorboards. The materials used: thicker linings, reinforced seams, and absorbent layers, were procured quietly, sometimes smuggled in from distant suppliers to avoid suspicion. For many men, these gloves represented more than a tool. They were a form of survival. Public knowledge of their illness would have destroyed their social standing, jeopardized their marriages, and ended their careers. The glove offered temporary control over a situation that had spiraled beyond their ability to manage. They clung to the illusion of health, using these items to protect themselves from questions, studies, and the threat of exposure. The black market glove became a fragile shield that preserved dignity only at the cost of constant fear. The craftsmanship of these specialized gloves differed markedly from the elegant satin versions displayed in fashionable districts. Medical black market gloves incorporated layers designed to contain fluids and prevent stains from seeping through. Their interiors were lined with materials capable of absorbing discharge without producing visible marks. The exterior remained smooth and polished, offering no hint of the decay that the glove concealed. Men who wore them often replaced pairs quickly, discarding them before the lining became saturated or odors betrayed their condition. The cost of maintenance was high, but the alternative, public humiliation, was considered far worse. Because of the stigma surrounding disease, customers rarely purchased from local merchants. Instead, many sought gloves imported from abroad, relying on international shipments to maintain distance between themselves and the source. Packages arrived under vague labels, declared as textiles or luxury fabrics. Some clients established ongoing arrangements with suppliers, ensuring a steady supply without ever revealing their identities. The anonymity of foreign trade provided reassurance, allowing men to continue their routines without fearing recognition. They accepted the higher prices as the necessary cost of secrecy. This underground economy thrived because Victorian society valued appearances above all else. The existence of such a market reflected the desperation of men who lacked safe, honest avenues for addressing their conditions. Rather than confronting disease openly, they navigated shadowy transactions and depended on merchants who preserved their anonymity. The black market became an extension of the era's moral contradictions. A society obsessed with propriety inadvertently encouraged a network of hidden exchanges designed to protect reputations instead of lives. In the eyes of those who used these gloves, each purchase marked another month of survival within a rigid social structure. They walked through crowded streets, attended formal dinners, and shook hands with confidence, trusting that the glove would conceal what their bodies could no longer control. Beneath that thin layer of manufactured refinement, fear lingered. Fear of discovery, fear of decline, and fear of the moment the glove could no longer contain the truth. The secret trade prospered because it promised a temporary answer in a world built on illusion. This hidden marketplace exposed how far men would go to preserve an image that felt essential to their survival, turning gloves into tools of deception rather than protection. That shadowed commerce revealed a society willing to ignore illness as long as its surface remained polished. Within this uneasy silence, a deeper fracture waited, ready to widen as the burden of concealment grew heavier. There was a man whose reputation once seemed unshakable, a public figure known for his eloquence, composure, and unwavering confidence in crowded rooms. His presence at formal gatherings had always been a reassurance to those around him, a reminder that dignity could be performed with grace, even in the strictest corners of Victorian society. He attended political meetings, charity events, and private dinners with a smile that appeared carved from certainty. For years, no one questioned him. No one suspected that beneath the smooth leather of his gloves, something was quietly rotting away. The night everything collapsed was supposed to be an evening of celebration. Candles glowed against polished silver. Orchestras murmured through soft waltzes, and guests drifted from table to table with the practiced ease of people accustomed to performing refinement. He arrived, wearing a dark coat and immaculate gloves, as he always did, and greeted acquaintances with the same calm nod that had long defined his public persona. Nothing in his demeanour hinted at the secret festering under the fabric. What happened next was small enough to be nearly missed. Some said he reached for a dropped napkin. Others insisted he simply adjusted his chair. Either way, his glove slipped. It caught on the edge of a glass or on the embroidery of the tablecloth, and the leather peeled back just far enough for a glimpse of what lay beneath. A woman sitting nearby let out a quiet gasp. Sharp, involuntary, impossible to ignore. Heads turned, conversations thinned, and in the pool of candlelight, the truth surfaced. His exposed skin was discoloured, swollen, and collapsing in on itself. The tips of his fingers were darkened, as if life had been drained from them long before the glove failed. The hand trembled slightly, though whether from pain or panic was impossible to tell. In a room governed by manners, silence spread faster than shock. It was the kind of silence that swallowed even the music, leaving only the sight of a man who had spent years trying to contain something that refused to stay hidden. He attempted to pull the glove back into place, but the gesture only intensified the unease. People stepped away from him without making a sound, as though distance might protect them from both illness and scandal. His reputation, once a kind of armour, shattered in a matter of seconds, and when he excused himself, unsteady and pale, no one followed. No one asked if he needed assistance. They simply watched him walk out, the glove hanging loosely from his damaged hand. By the next morning, whispers had spread across the city. The story travelled through offices, clubs, and dinner tables with remarkable speed. No details were confirmed, yet everyone repeated the same image. A ruined hand slipping into view beneath a glove meant to protect not the body, but the fragile illusion of health. He withdrew from public life within days, retreating from meetings and resigning from committees he had once led with effortless authority. Invitations stopped arriving. Newspapers, though careful with language, hinted at moral weakness rather than medical suffering. In a society obsessed with purity, decay of any kind was interpreted as a personal failing. He never returned to politics. Some said he moved to the countryside, others claimed he spent his remaining years indoors, rarely opening the curtains. His downfall became a quiet warning, whispered among men who feared similar exposure. The incident changed nothing about the disease itself, yet it transformed the culture surrounding it. Gloves grew thicker, social rules tightened, even casual gestures became choreographed to ensure that no piece of leather slipped out of place. The fear of being seen had always existed, but now it had a face, a story, and a cautionary ending. What made his collapse so powerful was not merely the illness, it was the way the discovery unfolded in public view. Victorian society was built upon a fragile system of appearances, one that demanded spotless surfaces while ignoring the human cost of maintaining them. His downfall revealed the truth that many already suspected. The polished elegance worn by men of influence was often nothing more than a thin barrier against humiliation. Behind every immaculate glove could be a story of desperation, fiction, or dread. His tragedy lingered because it showed how quickly admiration could turn into distance, how easily respect dissolved when confronted with something that did not fit the performance of propriety. Long after he disappeared from public life, men adjusted their gloves with nervous precision, afraid that one loose seam could unravel everything they had built. His disappearance revealed how quickly admiration could collapse once decay was exposed, leaving the public fearful of anything that hinted at concealed disease. The scandal tightened the grip of silence across drawing rooms and offices, pushing men to hide deeper behind leather and politeness. A quieter terror began forming in private homes, where a touch meant for affection carried a danger no glove could truly contain. Illness inside a Victorian home did not always begin with a cough or a fever. Sometimes it began with a quiet gesture, a hand resting on a shoulder, a father lifting a child, a husband brushing a strand of hair from his wife's face. These small movements, ordinary and tender, became the most dangerous moments when a man carried a disease he chose to hide. Many Victorian men convinced themselves that silence was a form of strength, that concealment protected their dignity, and that the gloves on their hands were enough to stop consequences from crossing into the lives of those who trusted them most. Inside the dim rooms where families ate, prayed, and slept, the truth seeped through cotton sheets and thin walls, spreading long before anyone dared to imagine that a household could crumble because of a secret worn beneath a layer of leather. The path of infection was rarely dramatic. A kiss of the hand, a shared towel, a moment of closeness in the narrow space of the marital bed. These were the channels through which disease travelled. Wives, unaware and obedient to the expectations of their era, had no reason to question their husband's health. Victorian morality taught them to endure quietly, to accept what came from the man they married, and to believe that illness was a test rather than a warning. The men themselves often pretended not to know the severity of their own symptoms. A sore hidden under a glove was easier to forget than to confront, and forgetting became a habit until forgetfulness turned fatal. For infants, the danger was sharper and swifter. Many children born to infected fathers carried the disease before they ever opened their eyes. Some lived only a few days, their small bodies weakened by a poison they never chose. Others survived long enough to suffer visibly, rashes that refused to heal, fevers that rose without explanation, cries that weakened over time. The tragedy was not only in the suffering, but in the bewilderment that filled Victorian households. Parents prayed, doctors speculated, neighbours gossiped, and no one spoke aloud the possibility that the man who held the child so tenderly had unknowingly passed death into the cradle. The gloves worn by these men became symbols of a deeper blindness. They covered hands, but they also covered responsibility. Society allowed men to hide, rewarded them for maintaining composure, and encouraged wives to trust without question. A husband who wore gloves for propriety was praised for refinement, even if the real motive was to conceal infection. The fabric that shielded him from judgment offered no protection to the family who shared his air, his linens, and his life. In this way, gloves became the least effective barrier and the most successful lie. Inside homes, the disease revealed itself slowly. A wife grew pale. A child developed a rash. A newborn failed to gain weight. These signs were dismissed as common ailments, the typical hazards of Victorian life. Doctors, limited by weak diagnostic tools and burdened by moral expectations, rarely accused respectable men of carrying a venereal illness. Instead, blame drifted toward fate, climate, or the mysterious frailty of women and children. The truth remained hidden, not because it was invisible, but because acknowledging it would shatter the carefully constructed image of the Victorian household as clean, upright, and orderly. When death finally entered the home, it did so quietly. A wife succumbed after months of unexplained decline. An infant died in its mother's arms, and grief hollowed out the family table. The man who caused the tragedy often stood at the funeral, gloves still on, unable to comprehend, or unwilling to confront, that his silence had paved the road to the cemetery. Victorian culture allowed him to walk away without confession, and in many cases, he convinced himself that he had been a victim as well. But the graves remained, small and numerous, each a quiet ledger of the price paid for secrecy. The moral foundations of Victorian society cracked under the weight of these hidden tragedies. Public life demanded discipline and purity, but private life allowed decay to flourish. The very men who preached morality from pulpits, courtrooms, and political podiums returned home, wearing gloves that concealed wounds they refused to name. In these homes, affection became dangerous, and trust became lethal. A single touch, the lightest gesture of love, could deliver a fate no one dared speak aloud. The story of domestic spread is not merely about disease. It is about the way fear reshaped affection, how silence corrupted intimacy, and how a family could unravel because truth had no place within its walls. Victorian men believed they were hiding shame. In reality, they were passing it on. The hidden suffering inside Victorian homes revealed how a father's silence could quietly reshape the fate of everyone who lived under his roof. The illusion of safety collapsed once the consequences touched wives, infants, and the fragile circle of domestic life. A deeper tragedy waited in the shadows as families faced what their husbands tried hardest to hide. Some Victorian men understood exactly what was happening to their bodies, yet decided not to flee from public life. They woke each morning with the same ritual, washing hands they could hardly bear to look at, slipping damaged fingers into gloves that no longer fit cleanly, and straightening their coats before stepping out into streets that had no idea how fragile they had become. They walked with the calm of people who had accepted the end long before anyone else did. These were men who no longer hoped for recovery, no longer argued with doctors, and no longer bothered to search for remedies whispered about in city alleys. Instead, they clung to small, precise actions, polishing boots, adjusting cuffs, choosing gloves without stains, as if these gestures allowed them to hold on to the last remaining pieces of themselves. Their decline was not sudden. It crept across the skin, settled into joints, and hollowed out the strength of their hands. Many felt the numbness first, a slow fading of sensation that made buttons difficult and writing painful. Others noticed the smell, faint at first, something metallic and sour that grew sharper each week. They knew what it meant. They had heard the stories whispered behind closed doors and seen enough hollow-eyed men vanish after months of hiding behind velvet and leather. But rather than retreat into their homes, they forced themselves into routines, attending meetings, visiting clubs, walking through markets, and nodding politely to acquaintances who never suspected the truth behind the immaculate gloves. Every step outside was a form of defiance. Victorian society valued appearances more than honesty, and these men used that obsession as a shield. A clean glove meant dignity. A firm handshake meant strength. No one asked questions when the performance remained flawless. This was the strange contract between a dying man and the world around him. He pretended to be intact, and everyone else pretended to believe him. At home, the reality was harder to manage. Removing the gloves became a private act, done slowly, often in darkness. Some men could no longer bear to look at their own hands. They wrapped them in cloth before sleeping, not for comfort, but to avoid glimpsing the wounds that marked the advance of a disease they had once thought they could control. Mirrors were avoided. Candles were extinguished earlier each night. Silence grew thick in the rooms where they changed clothes, where they washed, where they tried to steady themselves. Illness altered their posture, their breathing, even the sound of their footsteps. Yet when morning returned, they forced themselves into clothing that no longer felt familiar and left the house as if nothing had changed. What made their situation more tragic was the isolation they chose. Victorian morality dictated that a proper man carried his burdens privately, and these men believed secrecy preserved a kind of honor. They told no one, not even their wives, how advanced the illness had become. Some feared pity, others feared shame, but most feared being remembered as something ruined. So they continued to move through society with the same careful politeness, offering calm greetings, measured smiles, and gloved hands that never trembled in public. The closer they drew to the end, the more their gloves became symbols of something deeper. They were no longer merely tools for hiding sores or concealing odor. They became anchors, material proof that, for as long as the gloves stayed on, a man still possessed a shape the world could recognize. In these final months, the gloves were the last thing that separated dignity from collapse. Some men asked their servants to burn letters, diaries, and any evidence that hinted at their illness. Others insisted that no doctor be allowed near their bodies after death, fearing post-mortem revelations. But the most haunting requests came from those who instructed their families not to remove their gloves once they died. They wanted to be buried exactly as they had lived in their final days, with the last remnants of their identity intact, the damage hidden, the secret carried into the ground with them. Funerals for such men were strangely serene. Neighbours remarked on their elegance, the peacefulness of their expressions, the careful way their gloves had been chosen, free of stains, free of creases, clean enough to suggest a life of discipline rather than deterioration. No one asked why the gloves remained on. No one dared suggest taking them off. Victorian society understood the language of silence too well to break it. And so, in the end, these men achieved the only victory still available to them. They controlled the final image that the world would remember. The truth rotted beneath leather, but memory remained smooth and unblemished. It was the last comfort they allowed themselves, and the last lie the world was willing to accept. The quiet exit of these men revealed how far dignity could be stretched when a dying body refused to surrender its secrets. Their gloves became monuments to the final illusion they carried into their graves. Another layer of silence waited just beyond their burial, shaping how the living interpreted what they thought they knew. In the present day, a few Victorian gloves still rest inside museum drawers, climate-controlled storage rooms, or forgotten boxes in old estates. They are catalogued as fashion items, relics of elegance, examples of craftsmanship. From a century obsessed with appearance, curators note the stitching, the material, the cut, and the preservation of the leather. Visitors admire the refinement, the narrow fingers, the delicate seams. No one pauses long enough to imagine what these gloves once endured. They are treated as harmless artifacts, objects stripped of context, displayed behind glass like silent ornaments from a gentler time. Yet their surfaces hold a history that most people would rather not think about. These gloves once belonged to men who wore them daily, not for warmth or fashion alone, but for concealment. Behind their polished exterior, beneath layers of lambskin or kid leather, there were hands marked by disease, tissue softened by infection, sores that never healed, and wounds kept hidden from the world. The leather absorbed sweat thickened by fever, the lining pressed against skin that tore easily. A few stains remain invisible to the naked eye, faded traces of the lives the gloves protected, and the suffering they disguised. Most museums do not open old gloves. Conservators avoid handling them unless necessary, and even then, they touch only the exterior, careful and distant. To turn them inside out would feel intrusive, almost disrespectful, like prying into a secret that belonged to someone who never wished to be known. Some gloves are too fragile to manipulate. The leather cracks if bent. The lining crumbles at the slightest pressure. Time has made them delicate. But the secrecy they once preserved remains intact. There are collections where gloves are stored without labels identifying their owners. The records were lost, destroyed, or never kept. A pair of black gloves might have belonged to a solicitor who shook hands every day while hiding a lesion under his thumb. A soft ivory pair might have been worn by a gentleman who avoided candlelight, so his wife would never see the damage beneath. A set of grey gloves with gentle creasing could have concealed a man already dying, walking through public streets with a calmness that defied what was happening inside his body. Each pair is a container of untold stories, a boundary between past and present that no one dares cross. The unsettling truth is that these gloves are the most honest records of Victorian illness and shame. They endured what diaries omitted and doctors concealed. They shielded their wearers from exposure, from judgment, from the collapse of reputation. In this way, they carried the moral weight of a society that preferred silence over truth. They became the final witnesses of deteriorating hands, absorbing the physical evidence of lives shaped by fear and secrecy. The men who wore them may have believed the gloves would protect them from humiliation. Instead, they preserved the memory of that humiliation long after the men were buried. Some curators admit quietly that certain gloves in their collections feel unclean, though no tests confirm it. Something about their stiffness, their odour, or their brittle texture suggests they lived through more than polite social gatherings. A few are sealed in archival envelopes, not because they are dangerous, but because no one wishes to handle them casually. The reluctance is emotional, not scientific. People sense there is a story inside those gloves, a story they do not want passing through their own hands. In private estates, families sometimes discover gloves tucked into drawers, wrapped in fading paper. These are rarely displayed or donated. They are kept at the back of cupboards, undefined and avoided, as if their owners left behind something unresolved. Descendants do not talk about them. They do not try to learn why the gloves were stored away instead of being discarded. Victorian families understood discretion so thoroughly that even their heirs chose silence over inquiry. When one studies these gloves closely, it becomes clear that they are more than fashion remnants. They are physical echoes of a time when disease was hidden beneath layers of civility, when a man's dignity depended on what others were not allowed to see. They remind us that history is often shaped by what was concealed rather than what was revealed. Photographs captured the surface. Gloves carried the truth. To stand before a pair of these gloves is to feel the weight of an era that mastered the art of hiding its rot. They are small objects, almost delicate, yet they hold within them the remnants of lives lived in fear, pride, denial, and desperation. The hands that once inhabited them are long gone, but the silence remains intact, preserved as carefully as the leather itself. These surviving gloves exposed how Victorian life polished its exterior while burying truth behind spotless leather. Their untouched interiors hinted toward depths no viewer wished to confront, turning silence into truth's longest shadow. In nearby storage rests one more relic. Holding evidence Victorian dignity tried hardest to hide. Victorian society built its reputation on surfaces. Streets appeared orderly. Families posed neatly for photographs, and gentlemen walked with polished confidence, their gloves immaculate in every season. It was a time obsessed with refinement, where a stain on one's reputation mattered far more than the truth behind it. The glove became the clearest expression of this contradiction, a perfect covering stretched over something damaged, a layer of elegance sealing in a reality no one wanted to face. For many men, the glove was not merely clothing. It was a final refuge, a fragile shield between themselves and the world that demanded perfection from bodies already collapsing beneath the weight of disease. The era valued restraint, composure, and self-control above almost anything else. Men were taught to keep their voices steady, their expressions neutral, their secrets contained. Illness, especially of the kind that ate away at the hands, belonged in whispers, not conversation. The glove made secrecy possible. It allowed a man to enter a room and be judged by his posture, his coat, his words, never his hands. Those around him saw only refinement, while beneath the leather lay a truth too painful to acknowledge. In this way, the glove became an instrument of survival in a society that punished vulnerability. But the glove also carried a deeper meaning. It revealed how Victorian morality operated. Dignity depended on what could be hidden. A spotless glove represented discipline, even holiness, while a damaged hand represented failure. The body, with all its imperfections, threatened the image that society demanded. And so men learned to divide themselves into two layers. The outer layer, smooth and composed. The inner layer, wounded and silent. The glove simply made this division literal. Inside, drawing rooms lit by soft lamps. Gentlemen shook hands with confidence, their gloves tight and flawless. Their colleagues admired the craftsmanship of the stitching or the quality of the leather. No one suspected that beneath those gloves were fingers warped by infection, nails lost to disease, or skin that blistered with every touch. A polite handshake became a performance, a ritual in which both participants agreed not to question anything beyond what they could immediately see. This mutual blindness was considered courtesy. The tragedy lay not only in the diseases that devoured the hands of Victorian men, but in the moral structure that forced them to hide. Many of these men sought no help, confessed to no one, and died with secrets that shaped every moment of their final years. They believed that dignity required silence, that a man's worth depended on remaining untarnished in the eyes of others. The glove preserved that illusion, even as their bodies failed beneath it. Within households, the contradiction deepened. Wives admired their husbands' refinement. Unaware of the pain hidden beneath the gloves, they removed only in darkness. Children grew up believing that gloves were symbols of honor, not shields against shame. Servants cleaned, polished, and repaired gloves without realizing they were tending to instruments of concealment. A single pair of gloves could hold an entire family together, preventing questions no one dared to ask. In this sense, gloves did more than hide disease. They maintained the fragile architecture of Victorian domestic life. Even after death, the illusion persisted. Some men were buried with their gloves on, their families honoring requests made in whispers during their final days. The gloves sealed their secrets into the grave, allowing them to be remembered as dignified, upright, and respectable. The hands beneath might have been damaged beyond recognition. But the leather preserved the memory of an idealized self. Priests offered prayers, mourners bowed their heads, and no one thought to lift the glove and look beneath. Victorian funerals, like Victorian life, preferred beauty to truth. Over time, the gloves that survived entered museums and private collections. They became artifacts of fashion, admired for their craftsmanship and elegance. But their true significance remained unspoken. Visitors saw the surface and imagined a graceful era. Curators handled them with delicate respect, unaware of what once rested inside. The gloves became symbols of forgetting, objects that carried the weight of suffering but presented only smooth, perfect exteriors. Their silence echoed the silence of the men who wore them. When we study the Victorian age through these remnants, we discover a society that worshipped appearances to the point of blindness. Disease was not the enemy, exposure was. Decay was not the tragedy, recognition was. Men built their lives around the hope that no one would see the truth behind the glove. And in doing so, they helped create a culture that valued concealment more than compassion. The glove did not simply hide disease, it defined the very structure of Victorian morality. The deeper lesson within these artifacts is that concealment often outlives the people who depended on it. The gloves remain long after the hands that wore them have turned to dust. They sit quietly in storage, their surfaces unchanged, offering no hint of the turmoil they once shielded. To anyone who looks closely, they reveal the core of the Victorian paradox, a world that demanded perfection while quietly rotting beneath its own expectations. The glove, in its silence, tells the story of a century where men lived in fear of discovery, a century where shame dictated behavior more strongly than illness, a century where fabric and leather mattered more than human suffering, and a century where reputation was preserved at the cost of truth. Victorian society could polish its cities, refine its manners, and elevate its sense of morality. Yet beneath all of that lay a deep, persistent fragility. The glove stands as the perfect emblem, beautiful, clean, controlled, and entirely dependent on what it concealed. Those hidden hands, trembling behind leather, represent the real history of the age, one that photographs and portraits never captured. In the end, the glove's legacy is not in its elegance, but in the silence it maintained. It reminds us that an era celebrated for progress also harbored quiet devastation. It shows how easily a society can construct dignity on top of decay, and it reveals that sometimes the most powerful truths are the ones we choose not to touch. Victorian gloves survive not because they were durable, but because the secrets they carried were never confronted. They remain as quiet memorials to men who feared being seen, to families who lived in the shadow of those fears, and to an age that believed beauty could erase suffering. Thank you for staying through this journey into the hidden world beneath Victorian elegance. May your night be gentle, your rest be untroubled, and your thoughts drift quietly away from the weight of history's shadows. Sleep well, and let the darkness of the past settle softly as you close your eyes.